Jack,
John.
welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we are going to be talking about power and the force velocity spectrum and a number of the characteristics that make up what this spectrum does and how it contributes to performance.
Yeah.
And there's a number of areas that I think it might be worth us exploring around dynamic muscle behavior and particularly some of the more nuanced parts of power utilization.
Yeah, I think this is something that isn't discussed enough, but actually has so much relevance to physical development and also rehabilitation, particularly understanding different ways that we produce power and different variables that influence how we produce power as well, and how that relates to different types of profiles or phenotypes. So that is how different types of athletes or individuals produce force and particularly produce power.
Yeah, well, we've been having a number of discussions, as you know, about power development and how not only is it a big contributor to sports performance, but it's actually a large contributor to a lot of the more general activities that are related to day-to-day tasks.
Absolutely.
And particularly as you age, like I know it's an area that you have a lot of knowledge in, maintaining particularly the velocity component is really important for, say, dynamic balance activity. And
falls prevalence.
Exactly, yeah. I was just about to say, yeah, like falls prevalence is heavily associated with how much power someone maintains as they get older and their ability to balance in those dynamic kind of tasks.
Yeah.
So it is important, and we sort of probably sweep it under the rug because and we probably don't sweep it under the rug, but strength always seems to become the thing that we tend to utilize. And I think that's because it's probably easier to measure. Whereas power requires probably a little bit more input, but there's starting to be a lot more ways to quantify it and a lot more technology that's easily accessible to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, too, we can at least appreciate and assess some of the qualitative aspects of power of just actually getting people to move quickly. So I actually think you highlight another important thing there. We probably should talk about this more in this podcast, but power and its relationship to balance, because I feel like there is...
Well, do you want to tell us what your sort of understanding of those things are, Joe?
Well, when I think of balance, whether they're thinking, let's start from a general population perspective, and we think about balance and falls prevention, a lot of balance work is really done in more of a static nature. Yet balance really is about your ability to not only maintain your center of mass within your base of support, but how effectively you can correct that when you do see a disruption from an external perturbation.
Yeah.
And that's typically not related to how much force you can produce, but how quickly you can produce it. I mean, it's a classic example, and you see this in terms of how particularly elderly people, but the reality is you see it in a lot of, say, middle-aged or even younger people who have healthy functioning. But most people, neuromuscular system will be able to make a rapid response to make sure they correct where their center of mass is relative to their base of support. And that's ultimately what leads to falls in a lot of people. They simply just don't have the ability to be able to move their limbs at a speed in which to prevent themselves from falling over.
And I think that that's really important because we don't necessarily associate high velocity activity with the older population, but it's something that we need to be considering often with our prescription. And you brought up something there that I think is worth us discussing, and you spoke about like the rate of force development. So I think it's worth at this stage maybe exploring rate of force development, what it is, how it kind of contributes, and maybe some of the differentiations, because I think that's where sometimes people start to understand the divide that occurs between what we call very early rate of force development tasks and maybe more later rate of force development tasks. So do you want to maybe give a bit of an explanation for what rate of force development is and maybe some of what those phases are?
Sure. So rate of force development is rather self-explanatory. It's got to do with not just how much force you produce, but how quickly you produce it. And it's obviously intimately related to power. I think it's also worth mentioning then too that when we think of power, a lot of people think of it as force times velocity. There's a few other ways to think of it too, like work over time or force by distance over time. But ultimately, it's a combination of how quickly you produce, how much force you can produce, and how quickly you can produce it. And that's, I think, what has led to a lot of the common guidelines you see around how you develop force and velocity attributes, because there's a lot of recommendations and good evidence to back this up that doing strength development, so doing more of your heavy resistance training to build up some of those maximal force producing capacities, is very advantageous prior to integrating doing more explosive type tasks, whether that be, say, plyometrics or weightlifting.
And that's always going to be the case, because obviously it's a multiplier. So, that's one major component of it. But as we've been discussing, it's probably something, one, force tends to be, I think, a little bit more simple to develop. But also, I think a lot of times people use that to mask their lack of knowledge of how to create more of the velocity side of these capabilities.
Yeah, and I think the issue comes about of thinking of when it is appropriate to follow that more traditional approach of, say, developing maximal strength prior to power, but when it actually may not be appropriate. And that's probably a controversial thing to say of like, well, what are you saying? You shouldn't develop maximal strength prior to power?
Yeah, let's get into that, because I think it's a major area that we're interested in. And I don't think that we say that, we're experts on this. It's more that we're starting to explore these concepts. And when we have spoken with people that it is their area of study, they're not necessarily coming forth with these thoughts in the same way that we are. And I don't know whether we're maybe seeing it wrong, or potentially we're just seeing populations that they're not dealing with as often.
Well, to be fair though, I think this actually makes sense when you look at the literature as well, because first thing we need to think about then with power is going back to looking at rate of force development and thinking about, well, what is the window that you have to develop force? Now, typically for most individuals, if they're going to maximize their power, they're going to have a more prolonged period in which they create that force.
Yeah, so that would be considered sort of like that late rate of force development. And like for people who aren't aware of that, like how long is considered, a longer period of rate of force development?
There's actually, it seems to be this...
There's a bit of a window.
Yeah, some people say more than 150 milliseconds. Some people say more than 250 milliseconds.
But it's sort of probably in that window from 150 to 200 plus.
Correct.
So in the general terms, that's 0.15 or 0.2 of a second and up.
And I think to put that into context, it's probably worth thinking about, well, how long is that in terms of athletic tasks that we do? Yeah. So like I know for sprinting, you've obviously got a good idea of
so like in terms of contact times for someone running at a really high speed, they're usually between 0.08 and 0.1. Yeah. It might go out to 0.11 or 0.12, which is probably starting to get closer to what you're hitting with, jogging or not as fast running. So around that 0.1 or 100 milliseconds is considered, a normal kind of contact time for someone going, quite quickly. And that means that, as you said, that's below that window of that rate of force development that you mentioned.
Yeah, and then then think about other tasks, because like say for instance jogging, what's that typically?
About 0.15. Yeah, it's about 0.15, but it can be slower than that as well.
And then when you think about say a counter movement jump, we can even start to extend that even further.
Yeah, like it's half a second plus. Yeah.
And like I think for people who have worked with athletic populations before, you can also see a big variability when you don't have a time limit for how long you can produce force. You can see big variation. Some people will be a lot more springy, where they get off the ground much more quickly doing, say, something like a counter movement jump. Then you'll have those more slow type athletes. You see that, I think, in also weightlifters too. You've got more of that speed type profile.
Yeah, you think is it the Colombians who tend to be, they tend to be taller and really, really fast, as opposed to maybe some of the Eastern Europeans who are, they tend to be maybe a little bit stockier, slower, but stronger in terms of like their profile.
And you can see that in their anthropometrics, and you can see that in how they actually move the bar. So I think that's where we need to then think of going back to some of the basic ideas of what power is, i.e. force by velocity. We know that we can develop force capacity, and we're going to see an improvement in power because you've obviously improved one part of the equation. The question we need to ask ourselves, though, is how much transfer do we have of developing strength qualities when we start to think of more what we call elastic type activity or early RFD.
Yeah, because is that below that 150 millisecond period.
And in fact, I know there is, I'm sure there's probably multiple studies, but thinking about the correlation between your ability to produce early RFD, I think they've done a study of this in sprinters with like different measures. And the biggest factor related to the ability to produce to have better early RFD is your fiber typology.
Yeah.
So having more of that 2x fiber.
Yeah.
So
that's super fast twitch. Yeah. And I think that like the thing that from a common sense point of view that you're always thinking about is you physically do not have the time in order for your muscle to contract appropriately to create the necessary force to carry out that task appropriately.
Yes.
And that starts to then put the question in your head, okay, well, if the muscle is not the main driver of this movement and a particularly successful application of this movement, what is?
Well, and yeah, it's a point we need to discuss. And I think a good way of thinking about this is think about when you do a really heavy lift. Is it fast or is it slow? It's slow because if you're doing it from a static position, you're trying to maximize the amount of cross-bridge formation, because in that particular movement, when it's heavy and it's from a static position, all your force reduction is coming from the muscular or the active component of the muscle-tendon complex. As we start to add velocity, we're going to utilize more of our connective tissue network. And that can be even like looking at the actual myofiber when you think about, say, the titin structure, when we start to get a bit of a stretch shortening cycle. And then also starting to utilize some of the deep muscular connective tissue when we think about the epi, peri, endomysium, the ponderoses, and even the tendons. As we start to, the more we need to create a high amount of force within a very short time period, the behavior of the muscle tendon unit changes. This is something that I think people don't understand or appreciate enough, because for your very elastic type athlete, so that is the type of athlete who can produce a very high amount of force within a very short contact time, i.e. early RFD, most of their force production is not coming from the active component. We see a change in the behavior of the muscle tendon unit, where instead of the muscle shortening while the tendon stays the same length to be able to transfer the force from the muscle to the joint, we see the muscle acting a lot more isometrically as the tendon will lengthen and become more like a spring.
And does that differ comparing it to an isometric task itself?
What do you mean?
So if you're doing an isometric task, you mentioned there that the muscle's acting more isometrically. Does that change when you're not in a dynamic activity, like say like a jump task? Is it different? Do you used to get the same action with the tendon lengthening structure while the muscle maintains?
Are you talking about something like a counter movement jump where?
No, I'm saying, for instance, how is what you're describing there? Because you use the word isometric. So how does that differ to an isometric contraction with what's actually happening within the actual muscle tendon complex?
Oh, well, the difference is the speed at which the active components need to contract to be able to control the lengthening of the tendon is going to be a lot more rapid. Hence why those more 2x profiles are favorable when you start to see the dynamic muscle architecture favoring the tendon.
Yeah.
And then what that then allows is the tendon having elastic energy storage potential that are magnitudes higher than what the muscle can produce. You can then maximize your force reduction.
Now, the reason that I bring this up is obviously a lot of people are using isometrics to increase, say, stiffness qualities.
Okay, sure.
But in my mind...
You're talking about some of the like theories with running mechanics too, like with...
Yeah. It's become really popular, and even there's an Australian strength and conditioning coach that's really popularized it, particularly in the strength and conditioning world. But it's being used a hell of a lot for, say, tendon rehab. It's being used for a lot of different areas. However, I think, one of the things that we always talk about is unless you're exposing someone to the actual dynamic nature at the velocity that the tissue and the corresponding joint structures are undergoing, this concept that you're going to get this transfer from isometric tasks in terms of, say, stiffness qualities of the tendon or the muscle tendon complex compared to when they do it dynamically, I don't think that there is the same level of crossover that people discuss, because I haven't seen it, even though I've tried it, because as an inquisitive kind of practitioner, you're constantly see, okay, people are talking about it's going to increase these stiffness qualities, and there is research to suggest that it does start to change some of those stiffness properties. But ultimately, it always comes back to that idea of specificity. If you're not exposing them to the velocity, then they're not really prepared for, say, a ground contact in fast running.
Well, and that brings us to the next important variable for why you don't see that transfer of just doing, say, heavy isometrics, is because for those elastic profiles who can produce high rates of force within a really narrow time period, i.e. early RFD, it's in response to a high ground reaction force. And that's the thing that I think people forget. So at sprinting, for a good sprinter, they're accelerating their foot down into the ground because that's going to maximize the ground reaction force that they create. For those type of athletes too, they have the neuromuscular patterns to be able to transfer that ground reaction force through their lower limb, particularly store it into the tendon, because that's where it's going to get its elastic energy. Like it doesn't just come from nowhere.
Yeah.
It comes in response to that ground reaction, where it stores it and lengthens, and then obviously releases it back into the ground. So I think that's the missing part when you think about, well, trying to do isometric, just heavy isometrics, or even thinking about, say, power development. We need to consider not just how much force they need to produce, but and not just how the contact time in which they need to produce it, but how much ground reaction force they need to overcome, which was also about them utilizing that effectively to maximize force.
Yeah, and I think that obviously takes us into that very early RFD sort of part of the force velocity spectrum.
Absolutely.
And it starts to look at that much more elastic behavior. And, people will talk about those, elastic or plyometric kind of tasks.
And I think it's actually just worth mentioning there too. You and I have talked about this. There doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion in the literature about this concept of elastic behavior. And I think it's worth...
Well, I think that there is in pockets, but it's not necessarily in terms of how to develop it. I feel like because it seems to be very much nuanced, and it's probably an area that people who are involved in jumping sports tend to have knowledge in. I don't know that there are people that have done some of this research, but I don't know that it's being done to the same level as that slightly later RFD kind of movement jump, squat jump research has been done.
Yeah. I was just thinking, one thing I think that needs to be clarified is thinking of what exactly is elastic behavior. And so I think I tend to define it as your ability to produce rapid rates of force development within a short contact time whilst overcoming a large ground reaction force.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other variable that people forget about. And I think that brings us to a next point, because like you said, a lot of jumping type sports, obviously a lot of track coaches, jump coaches think about this and talk about it all the time. We need to think about, well, is this important for your field-based athletes and how do we actually go about developing power or elastic qualities in those type of athletes? And again, I think the general recommendation is to follow that conventional paradigm of let's really work on developing maximal strength, then power. And I think that actually has value and is probably appropriate to a lot of athletes in field-based sports because particularly in contact sports, you're going to need some level of strength.
Yeah, and hypertrophy for actual, being able to support the contact.
Correct. And generally speaking, how many athletes are going to be that type of speed or elastic profile relative to being that more hybrid or more of that endurance type profile? So then the reality is within a group setting, if you give everyone that conventional paradigm of let's develop maximal strength first,
you're going to be right most of the time.
On average, most people are going to get better. So and that's obviously a good thing. The problem is there going to be a subgroup of those elastic people who actually get a little bit slower in the process. And I guess the other question is, how does that affect their injury prevalence or risk as well? Because are you starting to provide stimulus for them that doesn't maximize how they actually perform and move on the pitch?
Yeah, it makes me think of, a couple of discussions that Keith Barr put forward, actually in a couple of other podcasts where we were saying that for those profiles, you need to do some of that strength for them to be able to be protective of their tendon structures.
Yes.
And I think that that's true. That's appropriate. They almost need to build up some of that body armor. They need to be able to build up some of the connective tissue structures that support the tendon complex.
Absolutely. There's probably always going to be some trade-off.
Yeah, but the thing that you tend to find is that it becomes particularly neuromuscularly taxing for those athletes. So fatigue becomes a really big factor. And we know that the ability to maintain, say, stiffness properties goes down as you fatigue.
Yes.
So if you've got an athlete who is that's one of the main mechanisms that they use in order to create that force output or, maintain those behaviors, then it's actually taking away their strength.
Yes.
And that's a real problem.
And it can be difficult too, because part of how an athlete performs on a pitch, field, whatever sport you were referring to, is also based on the tactics of how that coach or team plays. And I think the other big consideration too is the density of the games that they play, because as we've talked about before, having a fast twitch typology is actually a risk factor for developing injuries, particularly soft tissue injuries.
Yeah.
Because they're more likely to, like you said, experience more fatigue and lose that active stiffness. So they're going to experience more strain at the tissue level, but they also recover a lot more slowly. So there are some challenges for how you actually deal with those athletes, but it always comes back to, well, how do we actually want to maximize the qualities that athlete provides to the team, or to, it might be an individual sport, that allows them to be successful in how they perform.
Yeah, and we had this discussion when we had Lachlan James on about this idea that as time goes on, I think there's going to be much more of this profiling happening within these team settings. Absolutely. And I'm sure it is happening. I've had a discussion with a number of practitioners that work in those settings to try and develop more of that profiling, to put those people into sort of, whether it's training groups, whether it's positional groups, whether it's how they implement their specific kind of rehabilitation, whatever process they're going through there. I just don't know that it's necessarily being discussed at the level it probably needs to be, because I still don't see that, say, a goalkeeper in soccer should be doing the same training as a midfielder. They shouldn't be doing the same running. They shouldn't be doing the same, plyometric loads. They shouldn't be doing the same sort of, even, potentially they're probably not even doing the same strength program. And I know that better practitioners are making those adjustments, but that should also be happening at that more nuanced level within players who have different profiles in the same position. If you have a midfielder who's much more stop-start, much faster, much more change of direction, rather than the person who just grinds and runs, 12 to 15 kilometers a game, it's a very different profile. So the way that you address that and create a platform from which them to perform at their best is different.
Absolutely. And it actually made me think of, been reading quite a few articles recently about, say, maximal aerobic speed and anaerobic speed reserve. And some of the research put forward by, I don't know how to pronounce his surname. Is it Buchheit or? Boucher. Boucher, is it? Sorry.
Yeah, Martin Boucher.
I've been destroying some authors' names recently. Boucher and Lawson.
Yeah, and the good thing is, Martin's work is brilliant. Boucher. Yeah, because he's done so much of it in elites, EPL, a lot of the European soccer leagues. He's been a real leader in that area.
Well, and it's interesting because when they talk about conditioning, they talk about, are they that speed profile? Are they the hybrid? Are they endurance? And then depending on that profile, how do we train them? Do we need to do more that short interval, high intensity interval training? Do we need to do more the long interval, or even sort of sub-maximal continuous stuff with the endurance?
Yeah, and as I said, I think the better practitioners in the higher levels are doing that, but maybe more, as I said, in the conditioning side than they are in the power development or strength development side. Yeah. One of the discussions that we had, and we've had this said to us multiple times, and I think, both you and I push back against it, is this idea that in order to start working on that very early RFD capabilities, as you mentioned, you need to get to a certain level of strength capability, whether it's, say, 1.5 or 2 times body weight squat. And you sort of laugh because you think, well, and I've heard a number of people say this before. It's not definitely not my saying, but like kids are jumping off playgrounds and out of trees and running around and jumping up onto a ledge and jumping off a ledge. And essentially they're plyometric tasks. They're drop jumps, they're landings, single leg, double leg, they're hopping and bounding and doing all sorts of stuff, which fits into that very elastic natured task. You wouldn't ask a 5-year-old to start doing squats to 1.5 or 2 times their body weight in order to continue what they're doing. And even I think the other example of that, which there is a lot of development of these characteristics in gymnastics, and they start the training for these tasks at a very young age. It would be and it's probably something we should do. We should probably speak with, say, a gymnastics coach that really understands the development of these things and how they see what needs to be done in terms of the physical capacities to be able to carry out that level of explosiveness in the gymnastics hall.
Yeah, so it brings us back to this important point with resistance training and elastic athletes is we know that you're going to get that transition of fiber typology, which it comes back to using your reasoning of how much do you actually want for that individual athlete. Let's not talk about the group average here, but the individual. Maybe you need that to some extent. Maybe they need to build a bit of fatigue resistance because of that particular sport and the repeated bouts of contacts that they need. But how much is the question. And I mean, the reality is there's no right or wrong answer here.
No, it's individualized to the task they need to be able to complete for, whether it's within their team, whether it's for their individual sport or activity. And as we said, maybe even if it's for falls prevention, you need to be able to create the requirements that that person has for their day-to-day activity.
Yes.
Whether that be elite or not. And I think that's clearly becoming something that will start changing more and more. What I think might be good for us to discuss is, okay, well, how are you going to develop some of these things? We have had the discussion multiple times where there is literature talking about the development of power across the force velocity spectrum. And we said before, a lot of people develop it through strength tasks, and then a lot of literature, and particularly I think a lot of strength researchers, will go down the path saying, okay, well, you can use Olympic lifts to develop the more velocity end. But really, to me, that's in the middle. Well, that's nowhere near the really fast end.
And one I think the problems with this is you'll often see those graphs where you've got the force velocity curve.
Yeah,
right?
Creating that sort of shape.
People forget, it makes as you think about if you do the faster the contraction, the less force you can produce, and vice versa. The slower, the more force you can produce. The problem that people don't understand with that graph is that's looking at the force production of an individual myofiber.
Yeah.
The problem is when we think about human movement, using the whole myofascial system. So it's not just about the ability for the muscle to produce force, but the whole connective tissue.
And I think that's what's confusing, because if you look at the actual force that goes, whether it's through a particular tissue, say, for instance, like the calf complex, or even bone loading through, say, the tibia, or the general ground reaction force, they're in the many multiples of body weight. The ground reaction force in the top speed sprinting is between 4 and 5 times body weight. The actual forces impacting on, say, the calf complex or the knee or the quadricep is going up to 7, 8 times body weight. If you look at something like triple jumping, if you look at the forces that go through the ankle, they can be 15 to 18 times body weight. And when you think about that, you go, well, how is that not failing? And I think that starts to put together some of the concepts of functional anatomy that we don't necessarily discuss a lot.
Yeah. And this is one of the things going back to thinking of developing elastic capacity. We can't be oversimplistic or reductionistic of just thinking about what's happening at the muscle level. It's also.
Do you think that that's an issue related to what we can measure?
Absolutely. So, I feel like at least within Australia, we're very muscle-centric. We're thinking about the behaviour of what we call the musculoskeletal system, but often you and I refer to it as the myofascial or myofascial-skeletal system. But the problem is we're still in our infancy of understanding the behaviour, the characteristics, and the adaptations of the connective tissue system. And it's something that I think a lot of people don't even really think about. I think there's some pretty well-established understanding or adaptations where you say, for instance, seeing improvements in tendon stiffness from, say, heavy loading. But obviously the behavior of the connective tissue system is going to be very dependent not on just the actual force applied, but the rate of force applied, because we know that stiffness is actually related to the rate of loading itself. Hence why tendons will tend to act, will not change length that much when you do, say, high force, low velocity contraction, but will change a lot of length when you start to do more high velocity contractions.
Yeah, keep going.
Well, I was just going to say, and I think one thing that I always think really emphasizes this point is if you look at, say, elastic athletes, let's say a long jumper, and you get them to do a counter movement jump, and you can measure that. If you get them to do a depth jump, where they get them to jump off a 30 centimeter box, would you expect them to jump higher or lower? And the reality is a lot of them will actually jump higher because they have more ground reaction force to be able to utilize as an explosive.
It's funny you say that because there's many stories of the measurements that were done with Stefan Holm. Stefan Holm is he was the 2004 Olympic high jump champion, the Swedish athlete, and he was quite small for a high jumper. I think he was about 6 foot, so like 183, and he jumped 238, I believe, at his best. And he's still got the record for the highest jump over his own height, because most of them are pretty tall.
Yeah, sure.
And interestingly, there's a lot of discussion about the fact that when they measured his counter movement jump and he's jumping from a static position, it was pretty average. You know, it was like 40 or 50 centimeters, which for an athlete of that level was not good. But when you actually gave him the opportunity to create a huge amount of ground reaction force and stretch on his tendon structures, he could obviously jump really, really high. And it illustrates the point that you make, that when they have the opportunity to place very high ground reaction forces and very high velocities of stretch in their tendon and said musculo-tendinous kind of complex, those athletes know how to create the elastic behavior to really be explosive and create a lot more movement.
Yeah, so then going back to your question of like, how do we develop these type of qualities? Well, I think that's a good example. So we need to go back to thinking of what is elastic behavior. It's about, again, producing high force within short contact times and being able to utilize and overcome large ground reaction forces. So, I mean, certainly certain types of plyometric activities can do this, but we need to think about how we increase ground reaction forces in particular, as opposed to just being on the ground. Or the other thing is repetitive nature type activities. Too.
And I think, look, there is some good literature about how you start to, apply this sort of jump or plyometric training. Like I think something, and it's a very good reference starting point for most people, is the work, Jim Radcliffe's book, High Powered Plyometrics, I believe it's called. And for people who don't have a background in it, it's a really good starting point.
Absolutely.
And obviously you can use it for, that book doesn't really have any limitations. You can take that all up to elite level with the application. I know there's really good amount of research that obviously came out, like, Verkhoshansky's work was quite established in the area of, depth jumps and drop jumps and how they utilize that. And they talk about like the shock method. And I heard a funny story actually on one of the collaborators that was involved in translating some of his work, and said when the Soviet scientists were doing all the development of this through the 60s, 70s, 80s, they were looking at, depth jump, capabilities. And they found that, like, okay, if you keep exposing people to depth jumps, their ability to continually improve their elastic function and deal with those very, very high ground reaction forces kept improving. Excuse me. But they kept going higher and higher, and they found that when they got to about 3 meters, the athletes got scared. And I always thought that was super funny, because you imagine, an athlete 3 meters up in the air saying, I don't really want to jump off this box, it's a bit high. But it just shows you that they actually really did explore some of this. And I think one of the things that I think, and this is an aside, but one of the things I think is interesting is there's some really great research that came out of the Soviet Union, but I think it gets thrown in the bin sometimes because the idea is that it was all tainted by drugs.
Yeah, okay.
And I don't know that that's the case, and I think particularly North America, who influences the UK and Australia a hell of a lot, probably, the Cold War era idea that work that comes out of China or Russia is not as valid as what comes out of the English-speaking world, has probably held back sports science a little bit in its exploration of some of these ideas. And to give you an idea, and I always like telling this story because he's a good friend and he's obviously a great coach. Is John Boas, actually Dr. John Boas, is actually a physicist. He's one of Australia's best jumps coaches. But when he first started learning to jump, to coach jumps, he knew that the literature was there, and this was probably in the 60s or 70s. The literature was there, but it was in Russian. Yeah. So he went to, this is how switched on this guy is, he went to the effort of learning Russian so he could read textbooks. And I think what that highlights is the information is out there, but maybe we're not necessarily accepting it as being valid because it comes from the non-English speaking world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and going back to thinking about development, so one of the things we can do is think about how we can increase ground reaction forces by doing things like higher depth jumps. And I think the other big one too is thinking of whether you do double leg or single leg. But then the other big factor then too is how we reduce the contact time as well. And I know, like for you, like typically we're going to use that with doing certain types of cueing, particularly.
Yeah. We obviously, like in our discussion, we spoke about the cueing in our one of our previous discussions on the sensory motor control and how that kind of comes together with changing skills. And obviously you would potentially use different ways of doing it. Maybe you're using some sort of external cueing, or you use some sort of constraint where you actually remove the capability of the athlete to spend time on the ground, whether that's, if they're running and you're placing, say, wickets or cones, in their way, so they actually can't spend any time on the ground before they need to re-coordinate themselves.
Or like a really hot surface.
Yeah, like the surface of the sun, Jack. But I think that starts to give people the indication of, okay, like there's a couple of parameters that we're looking for here. Obviously, the output, the forces that create and the, potentially the jump height they're creating is important, but also how quickly can they create that? Yeah. And I think that starts to change the mentality a bit. Obviously we do a lot of jump testing to look at some of those elastic features. And there's probably two areas that we spend more time on than I think what people... or even, the people we're testing probably don't even consider, like they're all often asking like, oh, are you measuring the height? And most of the time it's like, no, we're not measuring the height. We're measuring how long you're on the ground. So your ground contact. And typically the other big thing that I know you mentioned just then was, the difference between single and double leg is massive. And even if you're not going from a high height, even if it's only say 15 centimeters, getting an idea of how well someone is able to, create the ability to stabilize and then use elastic capabilities off a single limb really starts to change your understanding of how well someone can control their limbs under ground reaction forces.
Yeah.
And I think, you mentioned before for team sports, to me, I think that's the big area that probably needs to be explored a hell of a lot more to get an indication of why we're seeing, the joint injuries we still see. I think that's probably part of it.
And the other element to consider is the ability to do these type of tasks in different planes, so vertical, horizontal, and lateral. Because again, most field sports are going to be multi-directional.
Yeah,
I think the other thing to consider too is, like I know for the way that we approach it is, this allows you to then more successfully assess the whole force velocity spectrum. And I think that's obviously a really important component from both performance and rehabilitation perspective.
Well, I think we need to highlight this. It's not saying that we're not measuring things like their force output or their strength at a maximal level, even if it's in, something like an isometric mid-thigh pull. We are looking at those things. It's just that when you start to look at the very dynamic nature of sport, particularly, if you're not measuring that very fast end, you're probably missing the most, most important moments of the sporting activity.
Absolutely.
Whether they're very fast change of directions, landings, contact times, ground reaction forces. They're the main things that are probably giving you an indication of how well that person is able to deal with those kind of forces.
Yes, and understanding for those elastic type of activities, the development of it requires quite unique stimulus. The transfer of doing your resistance training is going to be probably limited to an extent if you really want to see that very explosive nature.
And I think that's like, that makes me think straight away of like maybe one of the things that's changed in our practice over the course of the last couple of years is making sure that we're actually addressing features across that whole force velocity spectrum in the rehabilitation process.
Absolutely.
And not maybe waiting for those steps to be undertaken before we actually start bringing that in. You know, like very early on, we're trying to maintain some of those ground reaction forces at the right contact times, even when they don't have the capability of, say, running flat out. We're still thinking about, okay, how do we create these activities at that early RFD, you know, phase of the activity, so that we're not having to wait 2, 3, 4 months before we start actually implementing some of those things.
Yeah, and it's amazing how much a lot of athletes can do after, say, you know, a soft tissue strain, particularly when you start to restrict the range of movement of the particular task, you know, like, say, doing like a pogo type jump relative to, say, sprinting, where you're going to, say, load the hamstring a lot more from a lengthening perspective. But I think the other thing too that, well, I know you're similar, is it helps to make a lot of sense as well from an injury perspective when you assess the whole force velocity profiles of seeing where the biggest deficit is, because, and it may not always be that they haven't developed the elastic component enough. It might be that they need to develop more the power or maximal strength. It could be anywhere, but unless you assess, you don't actually see where the biggest deficit is, and therefore what are the biggest modulators to why that person got the injury in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's, and again, I think that's something that's changed a lot for us now that we probably have more technology to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
But the good thing is, as we mentioned before, the technology is getting easier. There's a lot of phone applications or, you know, applications you can put onto a tablet that will allow you to measure a lot of these things with a reasonable level of accuracy. You know, it's not research level, but it gives you the opportunity to kind of get a gauge. And I know that even, and we spoke about this with Lachlan James, the fact that even now in a lot of those applications, you can do things like, you know, velocity-based training with your lifts. You can look at, obviously, ground contacts. I know that for those that are interested, I think that the person to really look at both his research and the applications he's developed is Carlos Bellasabre, I think his name is, out of Spain, and he's done a huge amount of research validating the applications that he's built on the Apple kind of network. You know, and there's, you know, My Jump and My Sprint, you know, and there's Runmatic. There's all sorts of different things that he's started to put together, and they're super useful. And you can buy the whole suite for, I think it's less than $50. You know, the amount of technology and assistance that you'll get out of that for such a small price is going to really change the way, as you said, you measure some of these features that typically, and in the past, we really would have struggled to be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to talk to you about a concept that is probably only, you know, it's a gripe of mine that's been going for a while, and we did speak about it a little bit with Lachlan, is the idea of this transition that you get when you apply maybe more conventional, slower resistance training into someone who has a profile that is a bit more fast twitch, that they actually almost get a shift of their hybrid muscle fiber distribution towards that type, from a type 2X to a type 2A. And we've spoken about this a bit because clearly in someone who's in a very speed power orientated event, you want them to maintain as much as possible of their type 2X fiber typology, and you want to also obviously hypertrophy the type 2X fibers that they do have. So the cross-sectional area of those tissues grows. What are the ways in which, you know, in your mind, if you've got an athlete with that profile who is very fast twitch, you know, how are you applying the strength training? How are you applying your approach so that you do feel you're not shifting them away from what their actual capabilities and their sport potentially requires?
Yeah. Well, I don't know, actually interested to hear your thoughts on this too, but the biggest thing I think about is the metabolic capacity of the fiber type, because one of the trade-offs of having a 2X fiber is, although it has the greatest shortening velocity and the greatest ability to produce force, it does not have much fatigue resistance. So, and that's reflective in those type of speed or fast twitch profiles is they're very explosive in nature, but they can't maintain it for a long period of time. And I think you probably would see that in their behavior in field sports, where you might see them have short bursts of running very quickly, but then they're walking a lot at the same time too. They're not jogging. So I think the biggest thing we need to consider is the volume of their training, because the more volume that you provide, the more of that metabolic signal that you're going to give that's going to transition to potentially that more fatigue-resistant type 2A fiber.
And I think that there's, like, again, I think it's a cultural thing in Australia that we don't like to be seen as being lazy.
Yes.
So we often will prescribe a lot of training where we don't allow adequate recovery between bouts of the activity to not cause that shift. And I think that that's really something that we probably don't consider enough, and it probably means that your training sessions become very long, and there's a lot of time in between. But if you speak to, say, and you wouldn't even say that it's funny because it's called powerlifting, but you speak with powerlifters and they'll lift something and then they'll sit down for 15 minutes. Some of it is because they are lazy, but I don't know that there are a lot of coaches that are always willing to put in some sort of interventional exercise and then give a period of recovery that's as significant, unless they're in a very much a sprint type sport, track cycling, sprinting, where we're like, okay, well, you can have a good recovery now.
Well, absolutely. And like that makes a lot of sense too, because even from a bioenergetic standpoint, fiber typology is associated with how effectively you can use certain energy substrates. So like for that very fast twitch type 2X, they can deplete their phosphagen system so much more effectively than an endurance runner. And that's why, like, I think a good example of that is, think about after a 100-meter sprint in, say, the Olympics, we've got elite athletes. They're gassed. They're absolutely gassed, except for the person who wins. He continues to run on. But if you've got an endurance, a marathon runner to do 100 meters, they probably get to the end and,
they'll be fine.
They'll be fine. Now, obviously, they're going to run a lot more slowly because they don't have the...
Yeah, and you see this actually reflected in the measures that you get with the, say, even like production of lactate.
Yes.
Is actually higher in those speed power athletes than it is in those athletes that have much higher, say, metabolic capacity. We did some work testing a couple of sessions with the VIS physiologist, looking at what's happening. It was just interesting, like people who understand the kinetics of what goes on in how lactate builds within the bloodstream. And what you tend to see is, particularly in those fast twitch athletes, you see a much bigger build up in their lactate levels after a period of time, because they actually don't have the vascularization of their muscle tissue to actually bring it straight into the bloodstream.
Absolutely.
So it's quite interesting. He was saying, he's doing a few days before, he was testing with some of the endurance athletes. And, if you take a measure a minute or 2 minutes after, that's sort of their peak. If you look at with a sprint athlete, it's still going up 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes later, because it takes time to absorb into their actual bloodstream.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense when you think about, like, one of the limiting factors for type 1 fibers not being able to hypertrophy is they need to maintain a certain fiber to capillarization ratio to be able to provide enough oxygen for oxidative metabolism. And it also makes a lot of sense too, where there's quite a bit of literature showing that your fast twitch typology takes a lot longer to recover. And I think there's the metabolic component, but I think the other thing too is just the actual mechanical stress. And it seems that there is often a lot more structural damage and the potential for more muscle damage to occur in that fast twitch typology due to some of the actual microstructure characteristics of it as well, with like things like you typically see less cross-linking, so you won't get as much force transmission laterally, which makes a lot of sense, I think, when you think about it, because it's going to be
trying to create much velocity.
Yeah.
I think, like, maybe to finish up, I think if we discuss how we would maybe implement some of the training across and what kind of exercises we would potentially use across that sort of force velocity spectrum, and how, for people who are working in different populations, how they might be able to access that. Because obviously it makes sense if you've got an elite athlete, you can kind of do whatever you like, especially if they've got some history and exposure to say resistance training and field-based training and all that kind of stuff. But if you've got, say, adolescents, or you've got, say, an older populace, like where you would, like how you can still play some of those things.
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things to consider here. Like one, obviously their training history, because that's going to be a big factor for the magnitude and frequency of stresses that you can apply. I think we need to think about how we start to profile athletes a bit too, because they will give you indications of...
we should probably do a talk about profiling specifically.
That's probably a different one.
Yeah, but I think that there are some key giveaways for people, like anthropometric giveaways. We spoke about this when we spoke about running, but how their tendon structure actually looks. Do they have a long tendon, short tendon? How much muscle mass do they put on?
Yeah, I was admiring all of your sprint athletes in here before, John, looking at all their calves and going, look at those small bunched up calves.
Yeah, long tendons. And also, like obviously if you look at the other end, if you look at, say, like an endurance athlete, some of them are going to have some of those profiles.
Yes. But,
you tend to see that they gravitate towards things that endure and they're better as the activity goes on. And that can give you some information too, even if you just ask someone, do you prefer to do things, like in sport, for instance, are you someone who goes hard and then needs a rest, or are you someone who sort of grinds your way through it? Yeah. That starts to give you an indication pretty quickly what their profile actually looks like.
Yeah. And so like going back to your question, I mean, I think a lot of the ways that we develop your basic strength, endurance, maximal strength, power qualities, there's a lot of information out there. And don't necessarily
we don't need to go through necessarily those. But
I think with the elastic stuff, or even just building up more explosive capacity, I think a lot of people, particularly working in the general population or elderly groups, apprehensive to do that because there's a fear of, is there a danger associated with that?
Yeah, fast movements.
Absolutely.
Jumping.
Part of that is just thinking, like, be contextual about what's going to be appropriate for them. Like that could be as simple as doing a fast movement of their foot up and down on a step.
Yeah,
like,
it might be marching in place. It
absolutely.
Might be introducing them back to running drills, or
completely.
Really basic things that get them moving in different planes and at higher sort of velocities than what they're used to doing.
Yeah, I mean it's all relative in this, and I think the big thing too is, it's one of the really important things that we need to work on developing more within the general population, elderly people, is how do you just develop those qualities? And for a lot of them, it's going to be starting with very simple, basic movements. I mean, we're not going to be getting someone to do a depth jump on day one who has not been doing any type of physical activity for 30
I think the thing is, though, and this is probably the most important point, and I think this is something that we do as much as we can, is trying to dispel some of those fears, because the benefit for them undertaking that is huge. And I think it's become a lot more popular for the older populace to do more, say, compound lifting, squatting, deadlifting, all that kind of stuff. I think hopefully it starts to become more popular for them to undertake things like whether it's Olympic lift variations or dynamic, resistance training, but even things like, and I think we use this a fair bit as part of our sort of rehabilitation for running, but we do it a lot with our older populations, like getting them doing, as I said, like running drills or pulling sleds or doing tasks that they're clearly capable of doing, but people put them into the basket of like, oh, you don't need to do that anymore. We have people in their 70s and 80s doing these, and their main, I think of two prime examples that we see very often, and their main activity is golf. So it's not like they're trying to undertake running, but we actually expose them to some of those things because it does have the benefit that crosses over to our point right at the start, which was dynamic balance activities.
Yeah, and look, it's becoming ever more important because we live in a society where exercise and physical activity is optional. And so the more we can maintain certain physical qualities, including power, the better we position ourselves to be able to mitigate issues associated with dynapenia, i.e. muscle and neuromuscular loss from aging.
Was there anything else that you wanted to discuss, Jack?
No, I think we'll leave it there.
No. All right. So this episode of The Lateral Think is brought to you with the support of Strength by Numbers. Strength by Numbers have created an integrated clinical and sports performance system called the AXIT. The AXIT system uses force platforms dynamometry, and strain gauges to objectively measure everything from isolated movements to sports performance tasks. The system has greatly enhanced our clinical practice, decision-making, and objectivity. We are no longer guessing. The greatest thing is its ease of use, both for practitioners and for your clients. There are no wires, no fixed setup. It is a fully integrated Bluetooth system. This sounds like something that you would enhance your practice. Visit strengthbynumbers.com and tell them that Melbourne Athletic Development has sent you. Thank you for joining us.